For the residents of rural Tennessee, the year 2008 felt a little different. A quiet unease had settled over the sprawling fields and rolling hills, a feeling that something was deeply and fundamentally wrong. It was the kind of worry that didn't make headlines, a slow-burning anxiety that spread like a low-lying fog from one farmhouse to the next. The source of this dread was the disappearance of a young woman, a girl named Emily, from her family's farm just outside of Franklin. Her name, whispered in hushed tones at the local market, became a ghost story, a tragic tale without an ending. Her absence left an open wound, a constant nagging reminder that in the vast, serene landscape they called home, a predator might be lurking, hidden in plain sight. For 5 years the case went cold, 5 long years, filled with the grinding ache of not knowing. The police had followed every lead, interviewed every neighbor, but the trail had gone cold. Her face, a picture of youthful innocence, had been plastered on lampposts and milk cartons, a plea for help that seemed to have gone unanswered. The family, a tight-knit unit of hard-working farmers, had been shattered. Her father, a man whose hands were calloused from a lifetime of tilling the soil, spent his days staring out at the empty fields, a silent monument to his grief. Her mother, her face etched with a permanent sorrow, had never stopped hoping, never stopped praying for her daughter's return. They were a family of quiet strength, but this tragedy had tested them in ways they never thought possible. Emily's disappearance wasn't just a local mystery, it was a personal one, a family's private agony shared with the world. The last person to see her alive was her younger brother, who recalled her leaving the house on a bright, sunny afternoon. She was heading to a nearby creek, a place she often went to read, or simply enjoy the solitude. She was an artist at heart, a lover of nature, and the creek was her sanctuary. She had packed a small satchel with a sketchbook and some pencils, a water bottle, and a well-loved paperback. Her brother had waved goodbye from the porch, and she had smiled, her bright, youthful face full of light. That was the last time he saw that smile. When she didn't return for dinner, her family's initial concern began to curdle into panic. The first few hours were filled with frantic phone calls to her friends, with half-hearted jokes about her losing track of time. But as the sun began to set, casting long, mournful shadows across the farm, the truth, cold and unyielding, began to dawn on them. She wasn't just late, she was missing. The search began almost immediately. Neighbors, friends, and family members fanned out across the fields, their flashlights cutting through the deepening gloom like nervous fireflies. They called her name, their voices hoarse and strained, but only the wind and the rustling leaves answered. The air was thick with unspoken fear, the kind of fear that makes your stomach clench and your breath catch in your throat. The police arrived shortly after, their presence a stark and jarring contrast to the peaceful countryside. Their official, methodical movement seemed out of place in this tranquil setting, their flashlights sweeping over the land like accusatory fingers. They brought with them dogs, their keen noses sniffing the ground, their barks a desperate, lonely sound in the night. The search continued for days, expanding from the fields and forests to the nearby roads and towns. Helicopters with powerful searchlights crisscrossed the sky, their rotors a constant thrumming reminder of the ongoing tragedy. They were looking for a person, but all they found was her satchel, abandoned by the side of the creek. Inside everything was intact, the sketchbook, the pencils, the water bottle, and the book. Nothing seemed out of place, no signs of a struggle. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air, leaving only her belongings behind. The lack of a struggle, the pristine state of her belongings, only deepened the mystery. Was it a planned disappearance? The police considered every possibility, poring over her journals, talking to her friends, trying to find a reason, a clue, anything that would explain her sudden absence. But Emily was, by all accounts, a happy, well-adjusted young woman with no reason to run away. She was close to her family, had a group of good friends, and was looking forward to college. There were no secret boyfriends, no hidden struggles, no desperate pleas for help in her diary. The only mystery was her sudden, inexplicable disappearance. The case grew colder with each passing day. The initial flurry of activity gave way to a quiet, grim resolve. The search parties dwindled, the news cameras moved on to other stories, and the silence returned to the farm. A silence heavier and more profound than before. The family was left alone with their grief and the gnawing question that had no answer. Where was Emily, and why had she vanished without a trace? The police, for their part, never truly gave up. They kept a small, dedicated team on the case, a team that had become emotionally invested in the search for the missing farm girl. They revisited old leads, re-interviewed witnesses, and spent countless hours staring at the blank face of the missing person poster. But as the months turned into years, even their hope began to wane. The case had become a ghost in their files, a haunting reminder of the ones that got away. It seemed that Emily's story would forever remain a tragic mystery, a cautionary tale whispered in the Tennessee countryside. The family, meanwhile, had to find a way to live with the not knowing. The years had a way of blunting the sharp edges of grief, but the wound never truly healed. Emily's room remained untouched, a shrine to a life suspended in time. Her brother, who had been a boy when she disappeared, was now a young man, but the memory of her final smile, of the wave he had given her, was forever etched in his mind. The farm, once a place of comfort and security, now held a deep-seated sadness. Every field, every tree, every bend in the creek was a reminder of what they had lost. The family had to find a way to move on, but how do you move on from something that has no end? How do you find peace when a piece of your heart is missing? The answer was, you don't. You simply learn to live with the emptiness, a constant hollow ache in the center of your being. This was the silent tragedy of Emily's disappearance, a tragedy that extended far beyond the headlines and the missing person posters. It was a tragedy of a family, a community, and a quiet, peaceful landscape forever marked by an unspeakable act. The mystery of her vanishing act was a stain on the soul of the community, a stain that time, it seemed, would never be able to wash away. The years that followed were a blur of quiet despair and unfulfilled hope. The police department's cold case file for Emily's disappearance grew thicker with each passing year, a testament to the countless hours spent by detectives chasing ghosts. There were, of course, sporadic tips, a sighting in a neighboring state, an anonymous phone call, but each one led to a dead end, a flicker of hope extinguished just as quickly as it had appeared. The family endured. They lived their lives. They worked the farm, but the joy that once filled their home had been replaced by a quiet, pervasive sadness. They clung to the memories, to the pictures, to the ghost of their daughter that haunted the halls and the fields. Emily had not just disappeared. She had been erased. Her future, her potential, and her place in their lives simply gone. The community, too, felt the weight of her absence. They watched as the family weathered the storm, offering what comfort they could, but understanding that some pains are too deep to be soothed by kind words alone. The case became a kind of local legend, a chilling tale of a young woman who vanished from the safety of her own home. It was a story told in whispers, a reminder that evil could hide in the most unexpected places. For the investigators, the case was a personal failure. They had done everything by the book, but the lack of a body, the absence of a crime scene, had rendered their every effort useless. They had a feeling in their gut that this wasn't a runaway, that something terrible had happened, but without proof, without a single piece of evidence to point them in the right direction, they were stuck in a state of professional purgatory. They were detectives with no case to solve, just a question that burned in their minds with the intensity of a dying star. Where was Emily? Was she alive? Was she dead? The answers remained elusive, hidden somewhere in the vast, unforgiving landscape of rural Tennessee. The investigation had been exhaustive, but it had yielded nothing. They had searched the creek, dragged the pond, and combed the forests, but there was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no footprints, nothing to suggest a violent abduction. The case was a vacuum, a blank space on their files that taunted them with its emptiness. The lack of physical evidence was the most frustrating part. In most disappearances, there is something: a discarded shoe, a broken piece of jewelry, a faint trace of a struggle. But here, there was nothing. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. This absence of evidence led to a myriad of theories, both rational and outlandish. Some speculated she had been taken by a transient, someone just passing through the area. Others whispered about a local predator, a person who had managed to evade suspicion. The police, of course, had investigated all the registered sex offenders in the area, but none of them had a criminal history that suggested this kind of crime. They were all accounted for, their alibis checked and rechecked. So the mystery remained, a Gordian knot that no one could untie. The years had a way of dulling the urgency but not the pain. For the police, Emily's face on the poster was a constant presence, a reminder of their failure. For the family, it was a daily ache, a hole in their hearts that nothing could fill. They had to learn to live with the unanswered question, a question that was a part of their daily routine, as constant as the sunrise and the sunset. They talked about her still, not in hushed whispers, but in a way that kept her memory alive, as if she were just in the next room. They spoke of her artistic talent, her love for nature, her gentle spirit. They were determined that even if her physical self was gone, her memory would never be. This was their way of fighting back, their way of not letting the darkness win. The search had long since been abandoned, but the hope, a small and fragile thing, still lived. It was a hope that something, a phone call, a lucky break, would finally bring them the closure they so desperately needed. They knew, in their hearts, that the chances were slim, but they clung to that hope with a fierce, unwavering grip. It was all they had. And then one day, something shifted. It wasn't a phone call or a tip or a new piece of evidence. It was an unrelated arrest, a routine traffic stop that led to a startling discovery. The man, a local recluse named Arthur, was pulled over for a broken taillight. He was a quiet man, someone the neighbors knew by sight, but not by name. He lived in a small, dilapidated cabin on the outskirts of town, a place that was tucked away from the main roads and surrounded by a dense thicket of trees. The officer, a young man who had grown up in the area, noticed something odd during the stop. The back of the man's truck was covered in a thick tarp, and a strange metallic smell was emanating from under it. He asked the man what he was carrying, and the man, his eyes shifting nervously, mumbled something about scrap metal. The officer, his instincts tingling, asked him to lift the tarp. The man hesitated, his silence speaking volumes. The officer, his hand resting on the holster of his gun, insisted. Reluctantly, Arthur pulled back the tarp, and what the officer saw made his blood run cold. It wasn't scrap metal. It was a collection of rusted, discarded items, a jumble of twisted metal and frayed wires. Among the refuse, the officer's eyes fell upon a small, unassuming object. It was a necklace, a simple silver chain with a pendant shaped like a feather. It was a type of pendant that was common, but something about this one felt familiar. He had seen it before, on a missing person poster that had been taped to the wall of the precinct for years. It was the same necklace that Emily had been wearing on the day she disappeared, a small, intricate piece of jewelry that had been a gift from her mother. The officer, a quiet and observant man, had seen the poster so many times that the details of the necklace were etched into his memory. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was the break they had been waiting for. This simple, mundane object, a piece of forgotten jewelry, was about to shatter the silence that had surrounded the case for 5 long years. The discovery of the necklace was the first domino to fall. The police descended on Arthur's property like a storm. The small cabin, once a forgotten corner of the countryside, became a hub of forensic activity. Detectives and crime scene investigators, their faces grim and determined, meticulously combed through every inch of the man's property, their movements methodical and purposeful. Arthur, meanwhile, was brought in for questioning. He was a man of few words, his answers monosyllabic and evasive. He denied knowing anything about the missing girl, claiming he had found the necklace in a ditch by the side of the road. But the police knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that he was lying. The necklace was the key that would unlock a 5-year-old mystery. The search of Arthur's cabin and the surrounding property yielded more disturbing discoveries. Buried beneath a pile of leaves and dirt, they found a small, rusted arrowhead, the kind a child might find and keep as a treasure. It was a small, seemingly insignificant detail, but the family confirmed that Emily had a fascination with Native American artifacts, a hobby she had developed from her father, who was an amateur archaeologist. He had given her a small collection of arrowheads he had found on their property, and she had cherished them. The discovery of this specific arrowhead, a piece of her life and her passions, on the man's property, was not a coincidence. It was a confirmation of their worst fears. The police, their sense of urgency now at a fever pitch, brought in a new team of investigators, experts in cold cases and forensic analysis. They re-examined every piece of evidence from the original investigation, now with a new lens, a new understanding of the nature of the crime. They went back to the creek where her satchel had been found, now armed with the knowledge that the initial narrative, that of a simple runaway, was a lie. They began to look for signs of a struggle that had been missed, for clues that had been overlooked. The original investigation had been hampered by the lack of a body, but now, with the presence of a suspect, the search had a new focus. The discovery of the arrowhead and the necklace was just the beginning. The police, now with a warrant, began to dig on Arthur's property, their movements slow and deliberate, their shovels hitting the ground with a rhythmic, haunting sound. They were looking for a body, a grave, a final tragic resting place. The world held its breath. The local news media, which had long since forgotten the story, suddenly rediscovered it, and the small town was once again under the glare of the national spotlight. The family, meanwhile, was in a state of suspended agony. They had lived with the idea that their daughter was gone, but the possibility of a final, gruesome confirmation was a pain of a different kind. It was the pain of a wound being reopened, a scar being torn away. They wanted to know. They needed to know. But they also dreaded what they would find. The silence of the past 5 years had been a torment, but the truth, they knew, could be a hell of its own. The police, working tirelessly, began to excavate a small overgrown section of the property. The ground was rocky and difficult to dig, but they persevered, their determination fueled by a grim sense of purpose. And then they found it. Buried a few feet below the surface, covered with a layer of tarp, was a small, shallow grave. It was a moment of profound and terrible silence. The investigators, their movements now hushed and reverent, carefully removed the earth, their hands now gloved and their tools now meticulous. And as they did, a new, even more disturbing detail emerged. The grave was small, too small for a fully grown adult. It was the size of a child's coffin. This wasn't the final resting place of a young woman. It was a different, more chilling story entirely. The discovery of the child-sized grave sent a shockwave through the investigation. It was a detail that shattered every assumption, every theory they had ever held. This wasn't a random abduction. It was something far more sinister, a crime that had been planned and executed with a horrifying meticulousness. The grave was empty, but its presence was a chilling statement, a silent scream in the heart of the forest. The police, their faces now grim and determined, knew they were no longer looking for a simple body. They were looking for something much, much darker. The narrative had shifted from a tragic disappearance to a calculated, malevolent act. The empty grave was a piece of a puzzle, a clue that pointed to a much wider and much more horrific pattern of behavior. The man they had in custody wasn't just a suspect. He was a predator, a monster who had been living in their midst for years, hidden in the shadows of the peaceful countryside. The realization was a gut punch, a terrible, nauseating feeling that washed over the entire community. They had been living side by side with a man who had not only taken a life, but had also planned her final resting place, only to abandon it at the last minute. Why? The question hung in the air, a terrifying puzzle with a missing piece. The empty grave was a taunt, a macabre joke played by a deranged mind. The police, meanwhile, were relentless. They brought in forensic anthropologists to examine the soil, the tarp, the very structure of the grave itself. They were looking for any trace, any fragment of information that would explain the gruesome tableau. And as they dug deeper, a new, more horrifying discovery was made. They found a small, rusted radio antenna, the kind that would have been attached to a two-way radio. The antenna was bent and damaged, as if it had been ripped from its source with a violent force. This simple piece of metal, a discarded piece of technology, would become the final, terrible key to the mystery. The antenna was a link to another crime, a crime that had been long forgotten, a crime that had gone unsolved for years. It was a link to the disappearance of another young girl, a girl who had vanished from a hiking trail in the same area 5 years prior. The case had been a mystery, with no suspect, no motive, and no trace of the girl. Now the discovery of the antenna on Arthur's property connected the two cases, painting a picture of a serial predator who had been hunting in the same area for years. The police, their faces etched with a profound sense of dread, knew they were no longer dealing with a single tragedy. They were dealing with a pattern, a series of calculated and brutal murders that had gone unnoticed for years. The full scope of Arthur's crimes was about to be revealed, and it was a truth that was more horrifying than anyone could have ever imagined. The arrest of Arthur, a man who had lived in the shadows for years, was the spark that ignited a new and much more extensive investigation. The small, isolated cabin on the outskirts of town was no longer just a crime scene. It was a testament to the quiet horror that had been festering in the heart of the community. As the police continued to dig, their findings grew more and more disturbing. The empty child-sized grave was just the first layer of a much deeper mystery. They found a series of other, smaller burial sites, each one containing a collection of personal effects, mementos taken from his victims. There were small trinkets, pieces of clothing, and in one particularly chilling discovery, a series of intricately carved wooden figures, each one a miniature likeness of a person. It was a macabre collection, a monument to a twisted and deranged mind. Arthur, under the pressure of the mounting evidence, finally began to break. His initial denials gave way to a series of cryptic, rambling confessions. He spoke in a detached, emotionless tone, as if he were recounting a story about someone else. He didn't express remorse or regret. He simply laid out the facts, the gruesome details of a life lived in the dark. He confessed to the murder of Emily, the young farm girl, and to the murder of the other girl, the hiker from 5 years prior. He spoke of how he had planned the abductions, how he had stalked his victims, how he had lured them to his cabin with a series of simple, innocuous lies. He spoke of the empty grave, a place he had prepared for Emily, only to change his mind at the last minute. He didn't say why. The police, meanwhile, had found the final resting places of both girls, buried deep in the woods, a short distance from the cabin. The families who had lived with the gnawing uncertainty for so long were finally given the tragic closure they had so desperately craved. The news of the discovery and the confession sent a ripple of shock and horror through the community. The man they had known as a reclusive oddball was, in fact, a monster. The peaceful countryside they had called home was now a place of silent graves, a monument to the quiet horror that had been living in their midst. The story of Emily, once a ghost story, was now a true crime documentary, a tale of a predator who had evaded justice for years. The investigation, which had started with a single missing person report, had now evolved into a full-blown serial killer investigation, and the police, with the help of the forensic experts, began to piece together a timeline of Arthur's crimes. They discovered that he had a history of violent tendencies, a past filled with small-time arrests and restraining orders that had never escalated to anything more serious. He was a man who had flown under the radar, a man who had used the quiet, trusting nature of the community to his advantage. The story of Emily's disappearance wasn't just a story of a lost girl. It was a story of a community that had been lulled into a false sense of security, a community that had been forced to confront the dark side of human nature. The innocence of the small town was gone, replaced by a profound sense of loss and a deep-seated fear. The discovery of the other victims and the revelation of Arthur's true nature was a testament to the power of a single, seemingly insignificant piece of evidence. The feather pendant, a simple, beautiful object, had been the key that unlocked a door to a dark and terrible place. It was a reminder that in every crime there is a story waiting to be told, a story that can be revealed by the smallest, most overlooked details. The family, meanwhile, was left to mourn their daughter, this time with a terrible clarity of the truth. The long years of not knowing were over, but the pain of a life so cruelly cut short was a burden they would carry forever. They had their answers, but the truth, as it turned out, was even more devastating than the mystery. The silence had been a torment, but the sound of the truth was a profound and unyielding heartbreak. The story of Emily's vanishing act was a story of a life stolen, a family shattered, and a community forever changed. It was a story of a monster living in plain sight, a story that would serve as a chilling reminder that in the quiet, peaceful places, the most profound evils can sometimes take root. And as the story of the farm girl's disappearance came to a close, a new narrative began to emerge, a narrative of a predator finally brought to justice, and a community left to heal from a wound that would never truly close. The final act of this tragic drama was about to unfold, and it was a story of justice finally served, and of a community left to pick up the pieces of a life, and a world forever changed. The final chapter of the Emily saga was written not in a courtroom, but in the quiet, somber halls of justice. Arthur, the predator who had lived in plain sight, was tried and convicted for the murders of both young women. The evidence was irrefutable. The pendant, the arrowhead, the detailed confessions, and the grim discoveries on his property all painted a picture of a man who was not just a killer, but a collector of human lives. The trial was a grueling and emotional affair. The families of the victims, their faces a mask of grief and pain, sat in the front row, forced to listen to the horrifying details of their loved ones' last moments. The prosecutor laid out the case with a methodical precision, detailing Arthur's sinister planning, his cold-blooded execution of the crimes, and his macabre habit of collecting mementos from his victims. He was a monster who had meticulously planned his acts, who had stalked his prey with a chilling patience. The defense, meanwhile, attempted to paint a picture of a mentally disturbed man, a reclusive oddball who was incapable of such a heinous act. But the evidence spoke for itself. Arthur was not a man driven by madness, but by a chilling, calculated malice. The jury, after a short deliberation, returned with a verdict of guilty on all counts. The sentencing was a powerful and somber moment. The judge, his voice heavy with the weight of the moment, spoke of the profound tragedy of the case, of the lives lost, and of the community forever changed. He sentenced Arthur to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. It was a verdict that brought a quiet sense of justice, but no real peace. The families were left with the knowledge of what had happened, a knowledge that was a double-edged sword. The mystery was gone, but the pain remained, a constant, dull ache in their hearts. The story of Emily's disappearance, once a chilling mystery, was now a chilling warning. It was a reminder that in the quiet corners of the world, danger can lurk in the most unexpected places. It was a story that would be passed down from generation to generation, a cautionary tale about the predator who lived in the woods and the young woman who vanished without a trace. The community of Franklin, Tennessee, was forced to confront a truth they had never wanted to believe. Their peaceful, rural existence was not immune to the darkness that plagued the rest of the world. They had been a community of quiet trust, a place where people left their doors unlocked and their children played in the fields. But now that trust was broken, replaced by a quiet sense of unease. The landscape, once a symbol of peace and tranquility, now held a more sinister meaning. The rolling hills, the sprawling fields, the quiet creeks, they were no longer just a backdrop for a peaceful life. They were the silent witnesses to a series of unspeakable crimes, the final resting places of two young women who had their lives stolen from them. The farm where Emily had lived was no longer a place of youthful innocence. It was a place of quiet sorrow, a monument to a life cut short. Her room, once a shrine to a lost girl, was now a museum of a tragic past. The family, meanwhile, began the long, difficult process of healing. The closure, while painful, had freed them from the torment of the unknown. They could now begin to mourn, to grieve, to finally say goodbye to the daughter they had lost. They had their answers, but the pain of what had been revealed was a burden they would carry forever. They had fought for justice, and they had won, but the victory was a hollow one. The truth had set them free, but it had also broken their hearts. The story of the missing farm girl was a testament to the power of a single, small piece of evidence. The feather pendant, a simple gift from a mother to a daughter, had been the key that unlocked a door to a dark and terrible world. It was a reminder that in every crime there is a story waiting to be told, a story that can be revealed by the smallest, most overlooked details. The final poignant image of the story was not of a courtroom, but of a small, forgotten grave in the heart of the woods, a grave that was now marked with a simple headstone, a headstone that bore the name of a young woman who was taken too soon. It was a quiet, solemn monument to a life that should have been, a life that was stolen by a man who had lived in the shadows. The community of Franklin, Tennessee, was left to heal from a wound that would never truly close, a wound that was a permanent reminder of the quiet horror that had taken place in their midst. The story of the farm girl and the predator who lived nearby was a story of a community that had lost its innocence, a story that would serve as a chilling reminder that in the quiet, peaceful places, the most profound evils can sometimes take root. It was a story that had begun with a missing girl and ended with a horrifying truth, a truth that had been hidden in plain sight for 5 long, agonizing years.